HOA, Karen throws a wedding on my land while I'm on vacation. My wife and I own a beautiful 5-acre property just outside of town. The land has been in my family for generations, passed down from my grandfather who built the original farmhouse with his own hands. We've maintained it meticulously over the years, adding a lovely garden, a small orchard, and what my wife calls her enchanted forest, a natural wooded area with a charming clearing that's perfect for outdoor gatherings. We're not part of any HOA, but we do border a fancy gated community called the Estates at Cherry Creek. When they first built the development 10 years ago, they tried to pressure us into selling our land, but we refused. This apparently didn't sit well with certain members of their community, particularly their HOA president. For privacy's sake, let's just call her Karen. She's been a thorn in my side since day one, constantly complaining about everything from our chicken coop to the height of our grass. We've learned to ignore her for the most part, though she makes it difficult with her weekly violation notices that have no actual authority over our property. The real trouble started when my wife and I planned our first real vacation in 5 years, a 2-week trip to Europe we'd been saving up for. We arranged for my nephew to house sit, take care of our chickens, and keep an eye on things while we were gone. Unfortunately, 2 days before we were set to leave, my nephew got into a car accident. He was okay, thank goodness, but he had a concussion and couldn't help us out. We scrambled to find a replacement, but ended up having to ask our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, to just check on the chickens every couple of days. She agreed, bless her heart, though she couldn't do much more than that due to her arthritis. We set up security cameras around the property before leaving, just to be safe. They were the kind that send alerts to your phone when they detect movement. We figured we'd mostly be seeing deer and maybe the occasional delivery person, but boy were we wrong. The first week of our vacation was uneventful. Mrs. Johnson sent us daily pictures of the chickens. All was well. Then, 5 days before we were due to return, I started getting constant motion alerts from our security cameras. I opened the app to find dozens of people walking around our property, carrying tables, chairs, and what looked like party decorations. I couldn't believe my eyes. There, directing everyone like a 4-star general, was Karen, clipboard in hand and Bluetooth headset firmly in place. I immediately called Mrs. Johnson. "Oh yes," she said, sounding worried. "I tried to stop them, but that woman from the HOA said she had your permission to use the property for her daughter's wedding. She had some kind of document that looked official, but I wasn't sure." My blood was boiling. I tried calling Karen, but she didn't answer. I left a voicemail clearly stating she was trespassing and needed to cease all activities immediately. Then I called the police. The local sheriff's deputy who responded called me back an hour later. "Sir, the woman here is showing me a signed agreement giving her permission to use your property this weekend. It has what appears to be your signature on it." "That's impossible," I said. "I never signed anything. It must be forged." The deputy sighed. "Well, without you here in person to verify that, and with her having what looks like legitimate paperwork, there's not much I can do right now. This becomes a civil matter." I was furious but tried to think strategically. The security cameras were capturing everything, and I had documentation proving we were out of the country when this agreement was supposedly signed. I called my lawyer. "Document everything," he advised. "Let them dig themselves deeper. We'll handle this when you return." Over the next few days, I watched through the security cameras as they transformed our property into a wedding venue. They strung lights through our trees, set up a massive tent in the clearing, and even built a wooden arch where I assumed the ceremony would take place. The worst part was watching Karen strut around like she owned the place, directing people to clear out that ugly vegetable garden to make room for the catering tables. The wedding was scheduled for the day before we returned. I made sure our security cameras were recording everything. Through the footage, I watched as hundreds of guests arrived, parking all over our property, trampling my wife's flower beds and leaving tire tracks in our lawn. They set up bars, dance floors, and even brought in portable toilets, without any proper permits or permissions, I might add. The ceremony itself was actually quite lovely, I'll give them that. Karen's daughter made a beautiful bride, and they certainly spared no expense on the decorations. But watching strangers treat our private property like a public venue made my blood boil. When my wife and I finally returned home the next day, the place was a disaster. Empty bottles and trash everywhere, cigarette butts scattered across our lawn, and deep ruts in the grass from all the vehicles. Our vegetable garden was completely destroyed, and someone had broken several branches off our heritage apple trees to make room for their photo backdrop. But the real kicker? They'd left all their rental equipment, tables, chairs, tent, everything, exactly where it was, assuming they could come back sometime this week to clean up, according to the note Karen left taped to our door. That's when I put my plan into action. First thing Monday morning, I called every single rental company in town until I found the ones that had supplied the equipment for the wedding. I explained the situation and told them I wanted all their stuff off my property immediately. They were surprisingly understanding. Apparently Karen had a reputation. "Oh yeah, we know exactly who you're talking about," the tent rental guy said. "She tried to stiff us on payment for her son's graduation party last year. We'll be there within the hour to collect our stuff." I made sure to mention that I had video evidence of their equipment being used without proper permits on private property without the owner's consent. They got real interested in that. By noon, trucks from 3 different rental companies had arrived to collect their equipment. Karen showed up just as they were starting to take down the tent. "What do you think you're doing?" she screeched, running across my lawn in her designer heels. "Stop this immediately. We're not finished with the cleanup." I stepped forward. "Actually, you are. This is private property and you're trespassing. Again?" She turned to face me, her face red with anger. "How dare you? I had permission to use this property. I have it in writing." "You mean this?" I pulled out the forged document she'd shown the deputy. Interesting how I supposedly signed this 3 days after I left the country. I have passport stamps and security camera footage proving I wasn't even in the state, let alone signing any agreements with you. Her face went pale. That's not... You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said. "You committed fraud, trespassing, vandalism, and probably a dozen other crimes. But here's what's going to happen now." I handed her an itemized list I'd spent the morning preparing. "This is a bill for all the damage you and your wedding guests caused to my property. You have 48 hours to pay it in full, or I'm pressing criminal charges and filing a civil lawsuit that will make your head spin." She snatched the paper and her eyes went wide at the total. $50,000? You're insane. I'm not paying this." "Let's break it down, shall we?" I said calmly. "Destruction of our vegetable garden. That's our food for the year, by the way. Damage to century-old apple trees. Restoration of the lawn. Replacement of destroyed flower beds. Professional cleaning of the property. Lost income from our chicken's egg production due to stress. Removal of tire ruts. Security system fees. Legal consultation. Oh, and let's not forget the mental anguish of watching hundreds of strangers destroy our property while we were thousands of miles away. This is ridiculous. No judge would ever award you this much." I smiled. "Want to bet? Because I've got hours of security footage showing you directing people to destroy my garden, telling them to park on my lawn, and explicitly stating that you forged my signature. Plus testimony from Mrs. Johnson about your lies, and documentation proving I was out of the country. Should we let a judge decide?" She crumpled the paper in her fist. "I'll have you know my husband is a lawyer." "Perfect. Then he can explain to you exactly how much trouble you're in. I'm sure he'll be thrilled to hear about the forged document." That hit home. Karen's face went from red to white faster than I thought possible. Turns out her husband was a corporate lawyer who took his professional reputation very seriously. The last thing he'd want was to be associated with fraud. I need to make some calls," she stammered. "You have 48 hours, I reminded her. "Oh, and you might want to let your daughter know her wedding photos were taken on stolen property. That might cause some problems if she tries to sell them or publish them anywhere." Karen stormed off, already dialing her phone. I turned back to supervise the rental companies removing their equipment. By that evening, my property was clear of everything except the trash and damage left behind. The next morning, my lawyer called. Apparently, Karen's husband had reached out wanting to resolve this amicably. We set up a meeting for that afternoon. Karen showed up at my lawyer's office with her husband and daughter in tow. Gone was the entitled attitude, now she looked properly terrified. Her husband looked like he wanted to strangle her, and her daughter was in tears. "Before we begin," Karen's husband said, "my wife would like to make a full apology." Karen nodded meekly. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done any of this. The venue we booked went bankrupt 2 weeks before the wedding, and we were desperate, and your property is so beautiful." "So you committed fraud and destroyed my property instead of finding another venue?" I asked. Her daughter burst into fresh tears. "Mom told me you'd given permission. She said you were happy to help. Now my whole wedding was illegal and all my photos are worthless." "Karen," her husband said through gritted teeth, "tell them the rest." She swallowed hard. I may have also told the HOA board that you had agreed to let us use your property for other community events. We've been planning the annual summer festival for your back field." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You were planning to steal my property for more events?" "We'll pay the $50,000, her husband interrupted, plus an additional $10,000 for future landscaping costs. And Karen will be resigning from the HOA board, effective immediately." I looked at my lawyer, who nodded. It was a good offer. "Fine," I said, "but I want something else too." "Name it," Karen's husband said wearily. "I want a notarized letter sent to every household in your HOA, explaining exactly what happened. How Karen forged documents, destroyed private property, and tried to steal my land for community events. I want everyone to know why she's stepping down." "Absolutely not," Karen protested. Her husband silenced her with a look. "Done," he said. "I'll draft it myself." We signed the paperwork then and there. Karen wrote a check for $60,000, and her husband promised to have the letter out by the end of the week. True to his word, every house in the estates at Cherry Creek received a detailed letter 3 days later. The response was immediate and dramatic. Karen's fellow HOA board members were horrified to learn they'd nearly been implicated in her fraud. The neighbors who'd attended the wedding were mortified to learn they'd been unknowing accomplices to her crimes. The HOA held an emergency meeting to accept Karen's resignation and elect new leadership. The new board's first action was to send us a formal apology and a guarantee that they would respect our property rights going forward. Karen and her family put their house on the market the following week. Apparently, the shame of facing their neighbors was too much to bear. Last I heard, they'd moved to another state entirely. My wife and I used the settlement money to restore our property and install an even better security system. We also put up very clear, private property, no trespassing, signs along the border with the HOA community. The new HOA board actually helped us install them. Mrs. Johnson still checks on our chickens whenever we go away, though these days she's much more suspicious of anyone claiming to have permission to use our property. Can't blame her for that. As for me, well, I never thought I'd be the kind of person to ruin someone's wedding memories. But then again, I never thought someone would be entitled enough to steal my property for their daughter's wedding either. Sometimes karma has a way of working these things out. I did feel a bit bad for Karen's daughter, though. It's not her fault her mother is criminally entitled. So when she came by a month later to apologize personally, I offered to let her and her husband take some new wedding photos in our garden, with permission this time. She declined, saying she'd rather not have any reminders of her mother's crimes, which I completely understand. The new HOA board is much more reasonable to deal with. They even invited us to join the association properly, but we politely declined. Some fences, it seems, are better left intact. Edit. Wow, this blew up. Thanks for all the awards and comments. Many people have asked for an update, so here's what's happened in the 6 months since the wedding incident. Update. The karma just keeps coming. First off, remember how Karen and her family put their house up for sale? Well, that turned into its own drama. They initially listed it way above market value, thinking their premium HOA location would draw buyers. It didn't. The house sat empty for months while they'd already moved to their new place in another state. Then something interesting happened. One of their neighbors finally spilled the full tea about why Karen really resigned from the HOA board. Turns out she hadn't just planned to use my property for the summer festival. She'd been collecting deposits from neighbors for various events she planned to hold on my land. Yeah, she took $500 from me for my daughter's graduation party, one neighbor told me. Said she had an agreement with you to use the property for community events. She had this whole schedule planned out. The HOA's new board did an audit and found Karen had collected over $20,000 in deposits for future events, none of which could actually happen. She'd even started advertising my property as an exclusive community venue to people outside the neighborhood. When this came to light, her husband finally cracked. He filed for divorce, claiming her actions had destroyed his professional reputation. Apparently, several of his law firm's partners lived in the community and weren't too happy about being associated with fraud. The divorce filing led to even more revelations. Karen had used HOA funds to pay for parts of the wedding, falsifying records to hide the expenses. The new board is now pursuing criminal charges for embezzlement. They've also started refunding all those fraudulent event deposits, though Karen's husband is the one actually paying for it as part of their divorce settlement. Remember that forged permission document? Well, we finally found out who created it. A local college student came forward admitting Karen had paid her $200 to forge my signature. The student provided screenshots of their entire conversation, including Karen explicitly stating she knew it was illegal but didn't care because that old farm doesn't deserve such beautiful land anyway. The police were very interested in those messages. While we dropped our criminal charges as part of the settlement, the HOA board hadn't. They're pursuing fraud charges, and the prosecutor is using Karen's messages to the student as evidence of premeditation. But here's the real karma. Karen's daughter discovered her mother had used the HOA's money to pay for half the wedding without telling anyone. She was horrified and insisted on repaying it all herself. She sold her wedding dress and canceled her honeymoon to repay the stolen funds. I actually felt pretty bad for her. The daughter came to see me again last week. She was in tears. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I knew Mom could be difficult, but I never imagined she'd do something like this. She's ruined everything, my wedding memories, my parents' marriage, our family's reputation." I tried to comfort her, telling her none of this was her fault. That's when she surprised me with a request. "Would you consider letting us do a small vow renewal ceremony in your garden? Just me and my husband, no guests, no setup, just a chance to have one pure, honest memory in that beautiful space." How could I say no to that? We arranged for them to come by next spring when the garden's in full bloom. This time with proper permission and respect for the property. The HOA community has actually become much friendlier since all this happened. The new board invited us to their properly permitted community events held in their own clubhouse. Several neighbors have apologized for attending the illegal wedding, bringing us baked goods and offers to help restore the garden. We used part of the settlement money to install a high-end security system with cameras and motion sensors. We also built a proper fence along the HOA border, with all required permits, of course. The new board even split the cost with us since it helps clearly define property lines. Karen's house finally sold last month at a massive loss. The new owners are a lovely retired couple who brought us a bottle of wine and asked permission before planting some trees near our shared property line. What a concept! As for Karen herself, last we heard, she's trying to join the HOA board in her new community. But apparently her story has followed her. The internet never forgets, especially when you're caught forging documents and stealing property for a wedding. Our garden has fully recovered and is actually doing better than ever. We used some of the settlement money to install raised beds and a better irrigation system. The heritage apple trees survived and produced a bumper crop this fall. We donated most of the apples to the local food bank. Good karma and all that. Mrs. Johnson still keeps an eye on things when we're away, though now she has a direct line to our security company and isn't afraid to use it. She's become something of a neighborhood watchdog, which the new HOA board actually appreciates. The daughter's small vow renewal ceremony is scheduled for May. She's invited Mrs. Johnson to attend as a witness, which I think is a lovely gesture. Sometimes good things can come from bad situations. Looking back, this whole saga taught us some valuable lessons about standing up for our rights while still leaving room for redemption. Karen may never change, but her actions led to positive changes in the community and brought people together in unexpected ways. Oh, and one final bit of karma. Remember those wedding photos Karen's daughter couldn't use because they were taken illegally? Someone posted them on social media anyway. They went viral as an example of what not to do in wedding planning, with Karen being dubbed the wedding thief by hundreds of commenters. The photos have become a cautionary tale in local wedding planning groups. Karen tried to have them taken down, claiming copyright infringement, but since the photos were taken during the commission of a crime, trespassing and fraud, they're considered evidence and fair use. So they'll stay up forever as a reminder that karma always comes around eventually. Latest edit. Holy cow, this update blew up even bigger than the original. To answer the flood of new questions. 1. Yes, Karen is actually facing criminal charges now. The DA is pursuing fraud and embezzlement cases. 2. Her husband's divorce filing is public record. Apparently she's fighting over who has to pay all the legal fees. 3. The college student who forged the document got immunity for testifying against Karen. 4. No, we still don't want to start a wedding venue business, but we did let a local gardening club tour our restored garden, which was nice. 5. The new HOA board is installing security cameras around their community to prevent future Karen incidents, as they're calling them. Thanks for all the support, awards, and kind messages. Sometimes justice takes time, but it does come eventually.